Heavenly Stories.
Sparkles, what would you do if an army was chasing you, and the only thing standing between you and freedom was a raging sea? Sparkles. This is not just a story from ancient times, it's a story of courage, faith, and a miracle that has inspired millions for centuries. Today, we step into one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible, the crossing of the Red Sea, where God's power turned an impossible situation into a breathtaking victory. The Israelites had finally been set free from slavery in Egypt. After years of harsh labor and cruelty under Pharaoh, their cries for deliverance had reached God, and through his servant Moses, the plagues had struck Egypt one by one. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, shook Pharaoh's heart so deeply that he finally let the people go. For the Israelites, it felt like a dream. Families packed what little they had, children clung to their parents, and the people marched out of Egypt under the cover of night, led by Moses. Hope filled their hearts for the first time in generations. They were no longer slaves, they were a people chosen and delivered by God. But freedom wasn't going to come easy. Pharaoh's regret burned like fire. How could he let his entire workforce slip away? His pride and anger consumed him, and soon, the sound of war chariots thundered across the land. The Egyptians set out with their finest soldiers, determined to drag the Israelites back into chains. The Israelites didn't know it yet, but they were heading straight into a trap. Their journey led them toward the edge of the Red Sea, a massive body of water that stretched as far as the eye could see. There was no bridge, no boats, no way across. And behind them, the dust clouds of Pharaoh's army rose higher and higher into the sky. Panic swept through the people. Mothers held their children close. Fathers clenched their fists in despair. "Why did you bring us here, Moses?" they cried. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? You've brought us out here to die." Their voices trembled with fear, their hope collapsing as the impossible reality closed in. But Moses didn't waver. He looked at the sea, then back at the terrified faces of his people, and he lifted his voice with authority. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Those words echoed like thunder. Could it be true? Could God really save them from an army and a sea at the same time? The sun dipped lower, painting the waters in crimson and gold. The people trembled, waiting for what would come next. Pharaoh's chariots drew closer, their wheels rattling, their swords flashing. The Israelites were trapped, enemies behind them, the sea before them. And then, the miracle began. The angel of God, who had been guiding them, moved behind the camp. A pillar of cloud that had led them by day and a pillar of fire that had led them by night shifted its place, standing between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Darkness fell upon Pharaoh's army, but light shone upon God's people. It was a night unlike any other. And then God spoke to Moses. "Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide the waters, so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Moses lifted his staff. The people held their breath. And that's when the wind began to blow. Waterwave, imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean, the waves crashing, the wind howling, your enemies closing in. Would you believe that the waters could split in two before your very eyes? Water wave. That was the reality for the Israelites on that unforgettable night. Fear gripped their hearts as Pharaoh's army pressed closer, but something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would mark history forever. Moses stood tall, holding his staff high, his eyes fixed not on the sea, but on the God who had never abandoned them. Then, with one sweeping motion, he stretched out his hand over the waters. And the wind roared to life. It wasn't a gentle breeze, it was a mighty, driving wind sent by God himself. The sea trembled. The waters began to shift. Slowly, impossibly, the waves pulled back, towering upward like walls on both sides. The seabed, once hidden beneath raging waters, emerged dry and solid beneath their feet. The people gasped. Children clung tighter to their parents, eyes wide in wonder. Elders lifted their hands to the heavens, whispering prayers of awe and disbelief. Never before had they seen such power, such glory, such an unmistakable sign that God was with them. The path through the sea stretched wide, a highway of freedom carved by the hand of the Almighty. The pillar of fire still blazed behind them, holding back the Egyptians in a darkness they could not pierce. The Israelites were safe, but they had to move, and quickly. Go! Moses shouted, his voice echoing over the roar of the wind. The Lord has made a way. Walk in it. Step by step, the people entered the passage. Thousands upon thousands moved forward, families clutching their bundles, children stumbling across the dry ground, shepherds urging their flocks along. The sound of sandals slapped against the seabed, hearts pounding with both fear and hope. Everywhere they looked, water towered over them, like walls of glass reaching toward the heavens. The moonlight shimmered through the waves, illuminating flashes of fish darting inside, as if the sea itself stood frozen in awe. The path was long, stretching into the unknown, but each step was a miracle. Behind them, Pharaoh's army grew restless. The Egyptians could hear the rushing waters, the cries of the Israelites, the voice of the wind. Yet the pillar of fire kept them locked in shadow. They gnashed their teeth, eager for the moment it would lift so they could charge into the sea after their fleeing slaves. But inside the parted waters, the Israelites kept moving. Fear still lingered. What if the waters came crashing back? What if Pharaoh's chariots broke through? Yet something stronger than fear carried them forward, faith. For the first time, they were not running as slaves, but walking as a people led by the hand of God. Step after step, the impossible became reality. They had never been so close to freedom, but danger still loomed behind them. Because once the last Israelite stepped onto the seabed, the fire that blocked Pharaoh's army began to lift. And Pharaoh's heart grew harder than ever. With a shout, he drove his chariots forward. The ground shook as hundreds of horses thundered into the sea, their wheels spinning, their swords raised. Pharaoh was convinced, if the Israelites could cross, so could he. But he was about to learn a lesson that would echo for generations. Crossed swords: what happens when pride blinds you so deeply that you chase freedom into the jaws of danger. Crossed swords. Pharaoh had already seen 10 plagues devastate Egypt. He had already felt the heavy hand of God strike his nation. And yet, his heart remained as hard as stone. Watching the Israelites march into the parted sea, instead of fear, Pharaoh felt only rage. How dare they escape? How dare these former slaves walk free while Egypt's might trembled? With a cry of fury, he raised his arm. Forward! He commanded. The thunder of chariot wheels shook the night. Hundreds of horses charged into the sea path, their hooves pounding against the seabed that God himself had revealed. Egyptian soldiers shouted war cries, their armor glinting under the eerie moonlight that reflected off the walls of water on both sides. The Israelites heard the sound. Terror swept through the people like wildfire. Mothers pulled their children closer, fathers urged their families to run faster, glancing back at the approaching storm of soldiers. Their hearts raced. Would the miracle of the parted sea be enough to save them? Or would the Egyptians cut them down before they reached the far shore? But God was not finished. As Pharaoh's chariots thundered deeper into the sea, something strange began to happen. The wheels of the chariots shuddered. The ground that had been dry beneath the Israelites' feet suddenly felt heavy and uneven beneath the Egyptians. Horses stumbled. Wheels sank. Screeches filled the air as soldiers struggled to control their steeds. Confusion spread. The once unstoppable force of Pharaoh's army faltered. The soldiers cried out in panic. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Yet Pharaoh refused to retreat. His pride chained him harder than any iron. He whipped his chariot onward, deeper and deeper into the path carved by God. Meanwhile, the Israelites pressed on with all their strength. They could see the far shore now, the promise of freedom just ahead. Hope surged, but fear still clung tightly. The roar of the wind, the cries of the Egyptians, the pounding of footsteps all merged into one chaotic symphony. Moses stood at the rear, his staff still lifted, his gaze never leaving the waters that stood like mighty walls. He knew the power at work was not his own, but the hand of the Almighty. And he knew the end of this night would reveal once and for all who truly held the power, Pharaoh, or the God of Israel. The people stumbled out of the seabed one after another, their faces lit with awe and exhaustion. Freedom was within reach, but the danger was not over yet. Because behind them, Pharaoh and his army were still trapped between walls of water that would not hold forever. The moment of decision had come. Would God close the sea? Would Pharaoh escape? Or would this be the night that Egypt learned the final, devastating lesson about the God of Israel? The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then God spoke again to Moses. Water wave: what happens when the hand of God moves, and the very sea itself becomes a weapon of justice? Water wave. The Israelites had nearly all crossed. One by one, families stumbled onto the far shore, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They were breathless, trembling, but alive. Before them lay freedom. Behind them, the roar of chaos grew louder. Pharaoh's army was trapped in the heart of the sea. Chariots jammed against one another. Horses neighed wildly, slipping and stumbling on the muddy ground. Soldiers screamed as their wheels sank deeper, their strength failing against forces they could not understand. And then God spoke to Moses once more. Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians, their chariots and horsemen. The moment had come. Moses lifted his staff high into the air. His hand stretched out over the sea just as dawn began to break. Golden light spilled across the horizon, casting its glow upon the towering walls of water. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still. And then, it happened. The roar was deafening. The waters, held back by God's mighty power, came crashing down. Like thunder upon thunder, the waves slammed together with unstoppable force. The sea swallowed everything in its path. Pharaoh's soldiers screamed in terror as the walls of water collapsed over them. Chariots overturned, men were hurled into the depths, horses vanished beneath the foaming waves. The might of Egypt, its finest army, its strongest warriors, was crushed in a single moment by the hand of the Almighty. Pharaoh himself, once so proud and untouchable, could do nothing but watch in horror as his empire's pride was drowned before his eyes. The sea, which had opened its arms to the children of Israel, became a grave for Egypt's pride. On the far shore, the Israelites stood frozen. They watched the waters consume their enemies, their hearts pounding, their mouths open in shock. The same sea they had feared only hours ago had become their deliverance. The waves settled. The wind grew calm. Silence hung over the waters that only moments ago had been a battlefield of thunder and terror. Bodies of Egyptian soldiers and fragments of broken chariots floated lifelessly upon the surface. Pharaoh's power had been crushed forever. And the Israelites understood. They had not just escaped slavery. They had not just outrun Pharaoh. They had seen the very hand of God. The Lord of heaven and earth had fought for them, and won. Their fear turned into awe. Their despair transformed into joy. The people fell to their knees, lifting their hands, lifting their voices. A cry of worship rose from the shore, echoing across the desert sands. The Lord is our strength and our song. The Lord has become our salvation. It was the birth of a nation, not just freed from chains, but chosen, protected, and redeemed by the living God. Musical notes: what do you sing when you've just watched the impossible happen? When you've seen your enemies drowned and your future reborn in a single night? Musical notes. For the Israelites, there was only one answer: they sang. The people who had once been slaves, broken and hopeless, now stood free on the far shore of the Red Sea. Behind them, the waters rippled calmly, hiding the ruins of Pharaoh's pride beneath their depths. Before them stretched the wilderness, uncertain, yes, but filled with promise. They were no longer servants of Egypt. They were servants of the living God. And so, from the depths of their hearts, a song rose. Moses and the Israelites lifted their voices in triumph. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The desert air filled with music. Children clapped their hands. Women lifted their voices, dancing with tambourines. Men sang with strength, tears streaming down their faces. It was not just a song of victory, it was a song of identity, a song of freedom, a song that declared once and for all that the God of Israel was greater than any Pharaoh, greater than any army, greater than any sea. Miriam, the sister of Moses, took up her tambourine and led the women in a dance of joy. She sang, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The people laughed, cried, and shouted in one great chorus. Their fear had turned to faith. Their sorrow had turned to joy. Their chains had turned into freedom. But this was more than just the celebration of one night. The crossing of the Red Sea became a symbol for generations to come, a reminder that when all hope seems lost, when the enemy is too strong and the way forward is blocked, God himself can make a way. The Red Sea was not just water parted. It was slavery broken. It was fear defeated. It was the moment God's people stepped from death into life. Every time they told the story, fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, they remembered that night. The night the wind roared, the waters split, and the Almighty showed his power in a way no one could deny. The night God's people discovered what it truly meant to be free. And for us today, the story still speaks. It whispers to those who feel trapped, to those facing seas of their own, to those chased by fears and enemies they cannot overcome. The same God who opened the Red Sea is the God who still delivers, still protects, still saves. The Israelites looked across the desert ahead. Their journey was far from over. Challenges awaited them in the wilderness. But that day, they carried something greater than fear, they carried the memory of the sea that opened, and the God who walked with them. Freedom had begun. Fire. What if your greatest obstacle was actually the doorway to your destiny? Fire. For the Israelites, the Red Sea was that obstacle. What seemed like the end became the beginning. What felt like certain death became undeniable life. And what looked impossible became the stage for one of the most powerful miracles the world has ever known. The crossing of the Red Sea was not only about escaping Egypt. It was about transformation. The people who had lived for centuries under the weight of chains were no longer defined by fear, but by freedom. That night, they didn't just leave slavery behind, they stepped into their calling as God's chosen nation. Generations would look back on this moment as the ultimate picture of God's power to save. The prophets would remind Israel of the sea that split. The psalmists would sing of the waters that obeyed the command of the Almighty. Even in the New Testament, the apostles spoke of this miracle as a sign of God's deliverance for all who trust Him. And the message still echoes today. The Red Sea teaches us that when everything seems impossible, when enemies close in, when fear threatens to drown us, that's when God steps in. He doesn't just provide escape. He provides victory. He doesn't just move the waters. He transforms hearts. The Israelites would face new battles ahead. Hunger, thirst, doubts, and dangers awaited them in the wilderness. But the memory of the Red Sea gave them a foundation of faith. If God could part the sea, then surely He could guide them through the desert. Every wave that crashed against the shore that morning carried a message: the Lord fights for His people. And so, the story of Moses and the Red Sea is not just an ancient tale. It's a living reminder. A call to trust. A call to believe. A call to remember that no Pharaoh is greater than God, no army stronger than His hand, no sea too deep for his power to overcome. This is the God who delivers. This is the God who saves. And this is why the crossing of the Red Sea is more than history, it's a miracle that still speaks hope into the lives of millions today.